Welcome to the Kids Eating Broccoli podcast, where we believe that raising healthy kids shouldn't be complicated. Our mission is to inspire 20 million families worldwide to take the steps to raise the healthiest generation in our history. We'll interview some of the world's leading experts in nutrition, human potential, and children's health, as well as extraordinary chefs and foodies to gain insight into simple, fun, and creative ways to introduce natural health into homes across this planet. Some exciting news to share with everyone. I have teamed up with one of the most dynamic people in the ADHD, autism, chronic illness, natural healing world. Her name is Jen Kozek, and she's the author of Healing Without Hurting and the kids' book, A Healthy New Me and ADHD Free. And we've teamed up to create a special group experience for parents of kids who are struggling with any of these conditions, who are looking to help their kids function better and heal naturally, drug-free. The two of us work a lot individually with parents and on social media and online and podcasts and so forth, and we get lots of questions from parents, and often the same questions come up over and over again, which are, there's so much information out there. How do I know what direction to go? You know, I read this book and it told me to eat these things and feed my kid these things. And I read this other book that told me something else. And I read this book that said to get these tests. And I read this book that said those tests are useless and do these things instead. So we decided that what would be a valuable service would be to team up together, bring our own strengths, mine from the natural health, nutrition, neurology world, hers from, she's a practicing psychotherapist, and the mom of two kids who she's helped heal from these types of conditions naturally. So we have a lot of awesome background to bring to the table to really support parents like you. And our goal is to be able to lead you through step by step and be able to give you feedback along your journey. So the format is primarily a closed Facebook group, and it has a totally affordable monthly fee because we wanted to make it accessible and affordable for many people to be involved so we could get out there and make a difference, because both of us have the mission of impacting a huge number of parents and kids in this world and make the next generation the best generation. I am going to put the link in the show notes. So if you're not listening on the kidseatingbroccoli.com website or kidseatingbroccoli.podcast.com website, go there, find the show notes for this episode, and you'll find the link to find out more about the group, to sign up. I highly encourage you, and thank you for listening. We have Kathleen DiChiara, and she is a remarkable woman. She's the author of a book. Another one's coming out. She's been featured in a documentary film, and she also has been working as a functional nutrition practitioner. And she's going to share with us some of her story, where that took her and where she's headed into the future as far as her own work and how she's looking to help our kids and ourselves. So thanks so much for joining us, Kathleen. And I'd love for you to start by just telling us kind of your background, how you got to be doing what you're doing these days.
Great. Thanks for having me, Brad. My background is actually in capital markets and investor relations. So I was a corporate executive for a long time, and we had a child that was born with developmental delays and lots of, I would say developmental delays mostly, but then was diagnosed on the autism spectrum at the age of 3. And we just kind of plugged along as a family. We took him to speech language therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, didn't really think much of it. We ended up having our second child, and he was typically developing, and I think we kind of really noticed then that our first son was much more profoundly compromised than we had anticipated because we had no reference really to compare that to. And then many, many years later, I actually developed sudden onset neuropathy in my legs. It was during a very stressful period. And then fast forward, I ended up becoming very, very ill as a result of having back surgery to correct the neuropathy in my legs. So I ended up undergoing an L4, L5 discectomy, laminectomy, and then I woke up with postoperative paralysis as a result of that surgery. So I lost the career that I loved in investor relations and capital markets because I developed this poor response to surgery, and then ended up permanently disabled for life. So now we have a child with profound developmental delays and disabilities, and a 2-year-old, or actually an 18-month-old and a toddler, and I was disabled. So it was about 6 months after that he was then diagnosed with autism. So we were pretty much at our low point. That was a really, really stressful time. And then as a result of those complications and that illness, I ended up developing very complex autoimmune response. I developed food allergies, chronic pain syndrome, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, and then a complex series of other things. I started losing my vision and other neurological complications. They said I was in early stages of MS and so forth. So my journey into the health and nutrition and integrative work was actually a desperate attempt to save my own life. So it was out of my own awareness that I didn't have much else to turn to in terms of conventional medicine, and that if I continued on that path, I probably wouldn't be here today. So I did that to save my own life, and in doing so, learned a lot about immunology and nutrition, and certainly chronic pain and the immune system, and then realized that there was a lot I could do for my son. Because what I had done for myself really taught us a lot. And so we went on to actually have our third child many, many years later. And he developed immunological rashes and things like that that were quite surprising to us. So the long story short is that we were a family of 5, and we were kind of our own experiment. We were learning as we went. We were probably like many of your listeners today. We were having our own experiences at home, and things were happening to us, and we were trying to figure it out. And so there weren't a lot of options available to us through conventional medicine other than treatment and symptom management. And so part of why I am in the field that I am today is really our own adventure,
Gotcha.
Trying to figure that out. Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite a number of things. So
Yeah.
so let's jump to this. Well, not that it's the end, but let's jump to like how are all of you guys doing now?
Yeah. So we ended up participating, as you mentioned at the beginning, in a documentary film because we have had a transformation that's quite extraordinary. The reason I brought up my youngest son was because his chronic eczema was kind of that final awakening for us. We were very much into trying to figure out the different things that were affecting myself, my son, meaning my oldest son who had the autism, the cognitive disorders, the sensory processing, the learning challenges and things like that. And in many ways, we were really troubleshooting. We were using functional medicine and nutrition and supplemental protocols and restrictive diets to really help him. And when my youngest son developed this immunological response with this chronic eczema, I was very frustrated. I went to a neurologist, an immunologist and allergist, one of the best up in Boston. And I was very frustrated by his lack of knowledge about what was really happening for him. And that was just a huge turning point for us, that his immune system was responding to something in our home that I couldn't figure out, because we were already gluten-free and dairy-free, and we had removed dyes and sugars, and we didn't have all of these contaminants. And I thought, how is it that he could be so sensitive? We don't have chemicals in our home. We've sort of done all of the right things. And here I have this little boy who's 2, who is bleeding, and his skin is just raging and inflamed and irritated. And I thought, something is just terribly wrong with this picture. He should be the picture of health, right? His skin should be radiant and glowing, and his eyes should be bright. And I just took it upon myself to figure that out, and it was narrowed down to a very small amount of canola oil that was in a gluten-free pizza in the freezer. And that small amount that he had once in a while was enough to keep his skin in a perpetual cycle of inflammation. Even though he was having a very small amount of it was just once in a while. And that made me realize that that we were all affected by these small little bits of whatever it was in our environment. And so I'm sort of just painting this larger picture for you to say that we're on the other side of that now, but that was really a turning point for us because it really spoke volume that we were going about it the wrong way. You know, that we were really trying to troubleshoot each individual problem and symptom and dilemma. And there were still these little pieces, these little small, shall we say, chronic irritants that were just enough to sort of keep us humming along in a vicious cycle. And we had really underestimated those. And so that's when we drastically changed our diet. And I mean drastically in a sense that we actually just kind of simplified it. We removed anything that was non-organic. We just removed what I call the forbidden four. So the forbidden four being corn, canola, meaning genetically modified corn, canola, soy, and sugar. So those are the four big genetically modified crops. And we completely removed them from our home, making sure that we weren't having even the lowest exposure. I had known at that point that our gut lining was regenerating every 3 days, that we had a new gut lining. I knew that after each meal, it started a regenerative process within an hour. And so I thought, well, if our gut lining is a regenerative process and it is restoring, I can't keep bringing in small amounts of irritants that are going to break that process down. So I'm going to completely remove it and really allow that restoration process to happen. And that's what we did. So we switched to an organic diet. We went whole food based and really, really concentrated on that as being the foundation by which we would build. So my oldest son was the motive, by which we did that, but everyone in the family benefited. So collectively, we ended up actually healing from 21 chronic diseases as a result of that.
Wow. So primarily just from removing those forbidden four. And I mean, obviously you said eating all organic and
right.
And so I know that's, I've seen the documentary, which Secret Ingredients is the name. Yeah.
Yes. Secret. Yeah. Exactly.
And so, I mean, I've sort of seen more of the story in that sort of, cinematic format. But those four being genetically modified, can you just touch on how that could be, how do I want to ask it? How that small amount of canola oil could be causing such an incredible problem and what that has to do with them being genetically modified?
Yes, good question. And I'm glad you brought that up too, because a lot of times people say, well, how could that be enough? And I think really this is such an important question. And it's really probably one of the things that people struggle with the most, including myself, including us too, is that it isn't so much that what you're taking away, but what you're allowing to happen as a result of the removal. So what we were underestimating was that we were doing therapies, occupational therapy, physical therapy. We were eating lots of right things. We were supplementing. We were eating fermented foods and healing foods and taking fish oils. And there were so many great things that were happening. But we had this small amount of poison, shall we call it, going in and disrupting that delicate cell lining, which is only as thin as a piece of hair, thinner than. So our gut lining is as thin as a piece of hair on our head. So it's very vulnerable. It's very forgiving, but also very vulnerable. And so when we bring in a genetically modified food like glyphosate, or I should say like corn or canola, it has not only the alteration of the protein and the genetic modification of the actual crop, but then it's also sprayed with glyphosate, which is an antibiotic, right? So it's been treated now with an herbicide that is also an antibiotic. So there's two things happening there. You're bringing in something that is genetically altered that your body doesn't recognize and is irritating to the intestinal lining, but also you're bringing in a food that has glyphosate on it that is damaging to your microbiome. So it is, in essence, that problem, and then you have all of these other things that you're doing for the body that you can't really necessarily take advantage of. So when we removed that burden, I call lifting the burden from the body, by taking that out of the equation, what happened was we then allowed all the other things that we had been doing to really take hold. So you're sort of asking the body to benefit from intense therapy, speech therapy, beneficial foods that are really intense, nutrient rich. But then you have this chronic inflammatory state that's happening. So every time you're eating a food that's inflammatory to the gut lining, you're also opening up those tight junctions, which then releases lipopolysaccharides. I mean, there's just a lot happening when you sort of create that vulnerability in the stomach. So I don't want to say that you're just doing that and boy, how could that be enough? It's important to look at it in the context of what other things are you allowing to happen that wouldn't otherwise take place. And that's really where our world opened up. We thought, boy, we really underestimated, the potential for all the other things that we had really been working on to take place. And that's where we saw most of the change, I think.
Gotcha. So what I hear you saying, amongst other things, is that even though you were doing all of these things which are beneficial and helpful and healthy to do, dietary changes, eating, healthy foods, therapies, right, that because there was this chronic insult to this important, the gut lining, what you're talking about, that none of those could reach their potential in terms of really helping you guys heal until you solved that. Sort of like that was the last piece or a key piece to the puzzle, that without, none of the other stuff could work fully.
Yeah, for us, it was disease management. Mm-hmm. So we were in what we would call a holistic management. Mm-hmm. We were holistically managing chronic symptoms using lots of intense therapies, but not necessarily using them for the full benefit of totally reducing inflammation, getting full cognitive restoration to the brain. I mean, what we have to realize is that we know we can utilize the microbes in the gut to travel up the vagus nerve. That's a bidirectional highway to the brain to reduce inflammation, to enhance the qualities of the brain. And if the microbes and the foods that we're doing and the supplements that we're taking and all these wonderful things are constantly putting out inflammation, then in essence we really are not utilizing their full potential. So my feeling was, I don't want to keep putting out the fire. I'm done managing this. I'm done just being on rescue here. I really want to know what it is that we can do and his eczema was the telltale sign, because we could get it to calm down and then it would just come back. Mm-hmm. And it was sort of there. So that to me was a very visual indication that something in our environment was irritating us. And it was that red flag. And what I like to say to other families is, if you have a child in your home that has ADHD, it's sort of that invitation for everyone in the home to change, right? It isn't usually that somebody in the family is just struggling with ADHD, but everyone else is doing dynamic. Everyone else is feeling amazing. No one else has any health issues. Everyone else is just doing at the top of their game. They're free from all symptoms and disease. And then you just have this one person that's struggling. I mean, I don't know any other family that's having that experience. Certainly that wasn't the case for us. We all were doing okay, but everyone had a different manifestation of something. And so really what it is an invitation to say, okay, well, this child is presenting as a child with symptoms of ADHD, but dad might be struggling with rosacea and mom might have symptoms of, autoimmune conditions, and your other children might have anxiety or sleep issues. And so really it's an opportunity for everybody to evaluate all the things that you're doing in your life and together and work together collectively as a community, as a unit, and do things differently. And then you all pull each other over the finish line. It's really an extraordinary shift when you all do that. And that was certainly our experience. And the people in my clinical practice that do that have the same experience.
Cool. So a question that's come up already in our summit with different presenter speakers talking about some of these lifestyle changes and things like that is, that sounds great, but how in the world can I ever get my kid to do it? So maybe you can share from both perspectives if there are any difference, but how you did it, and then maybe how you, when you work with other people, how you help them do it.
Yes, and meaning how do you get them to change their diet?
Yeah.
Well, when you're all doing it together, it's easier because then there's no isolation of you have to change and I don't. And so that in and of itself is very isolating and very difficult to implement because by that very nature, people feel like something's wrong or you have to start policing who's going to do what. So doing it together. Secondly, usually there is a transition stage. You are essentially upgrading processed food. You're taking whatever the child is typically used to, and then you're creating an organic or healthier version of that same food. So it might be that they're only eating pasta, and so now you're getting an organic rice version pasta, which is going to be expensive initially because really what you're doing is you're paying for gluten-free organic processed food. So the quicker you can get out of that phase, the better, because that's a very costly adventure to stay in. So you're just at the very quick transition. The idea is to not stay in that zone very long. That's just for your sanity. So you're moving out of that zone very quickly. Secondly is to work within the context of what your child is doing. So if you have children that only like to eat meat, for example, like that's what they like, they feel good on it, is to, I think, connect with the nutritionist who is knowledgeable about what's ideally healthy. So, for example, we know that specific bacteria in the body produce endotoxins when they metabolize meat. Not that meat is bad or that certain foods are good or bad. It's just that this is basic biochemistry, that when they metabolize meat, there's certain endotoxins that are produced. So you want to offset that. So you want to make sure there's certain types of herbs that are present when the meat is eaten, or you want to make sure that they take certain fish oils when that meat is eaten, and then that will offset any endotoxins as oxidative stress. So what you're doing is you're just trying to say, what is it that my children like? And then how do I upgrade that in a way that allows them to thrive? And then quickly try to transition them to whole foods. It's very hard if children are eating processed foods to get them to like whole foods. They're just not going to do it. It's not that I'm saying this is easy. I mean, I have young children. This is not because I'm saying it's easy. It's just that you're going to get where you need to get to much faster if you recognize that the staying in that other place too long is actually keeping you in the management stage of managing the symptoms of ADHD maybe longer than you need to. That the body is actually very, very quick to heal. That leaky gut is not a life sentence. That we don't actually stay in the perpetual state of chronic inflammation very long unless something is creating that inflammatory response chronically. So the idea is to recognize that the body is self-healing and it actually repairs very quickly. So the sooner you can create that intervention, then the body is actually going to give you that opportunity to heal and restore. And then you're not going to have to stay in that very restrictive lane for a long time. You can actually navigate out of that and expand the diet. So I think people fear that they're going to have to be a prisoner to their kitchen forever. Like, I'm going to have to stay in my kitchen and prepare all this food, and who has time for that? And I just want to say that that's actually not the case. You're just trying to prioritize that healing response. You're trying to get away from these very irritating ingredients in food, allow that healing to take place, and let the body do what it needs to do, and then move from there. It's sort of like you're never ever in one place, because the body has to be viewed as an ecosystem. it isn't just this machine that is the way it is, this stagnant, state. The body is always changing and evolving. So the ecosystem of the body is always evolving based on its current state, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really valuable to look at, to understand that there are some time-limited stages,
Yes.
that can help, because some of those aren't going to be easy, but
Right.
you know that there's the next step you can take.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's really cool. So in there you mentioned a couple things that maybe you could give us a little more info on if you want, or if you would. I know you mentioned some different things about the strains of bacteria in your digestive system and how those can affect you. And then you sort of touched on some things to add with different foods. And I know you had mentioned wanting to share about key foods that help with the system healing. Maybe you could kind of touch on those things a little bit more.
Yeah, I can kind of wrap that together too. I think, when you are trying to shift the diet, and again, I don't want people to think that there is no one way to do this. Again, I think it's about recognizing, what works best for each child. I think one of the hardest things about today is that we have this abundance of information, and with an abundance of information, which is such a gift, is that it can be very difficult to determine what's right for you or what's right for your particular child. So there's that double-edged sword of wanting to gather information from other people, but then feeling lost and saying, well, what do I do? What am I supposed to do? What did Kathleen do for her family? Or what did Brad do? Or, how is that applicable to me? And how do I insert that into my life? And that is one of the challenges we face today, that our children are unique, and the only thing that's so critical to how they're going to respond is, in essence, their microbiome, which is as unique to them as their fingerprint. And so if I were to say to you that these particular foods are healing foods and they're really great, and let's say I said, this is a really great diet, and these foods are really great, and you would apply those principles and give them to your child, and your child had a particular type of bacteria that then reacted poorly to a particular fiber or a particular protein, and did poorly, then that would not work, right? So then that would be something that you'd have to be aware of. And so the idea is to always take information, but then be very clear that if your child is not doing well, it doesn't mean go harder, push harder. It means back off and troubleshoot, kind of like what we did with figuring out what was really at play for our son, is that sometimes it's more art than science, and recognizing certain foods, and that because your body is 99% bacteria, that those bacteria are responding to everything that comes into the body. And so when you bring in even a healing food, if the body is creating a metabolite or a secondary byproduct from eating that food, it can create a problem for your child. And that isn't necessarily a good thing. Sometimes we label these things as it's die-off, it's detoxification. No, it can in fact be a problem. And it's important to pay attention to that and to back off. So good examples of that is a lot of times people will say, oh, coconut oil is great, it's amazing, and everyone should use coconut oil. But coconut oil is also antimicrobial. And so if we take in too much of an antimicrobial, antifungal, it can kill off too much and create secondary byproducts, which can be too much for a child who is compromised. And then you're asking them to clear all of those secondary byproducts, and that can really be too much on their system. So we just want to always recognize that too much of a good thing cannot not always be a good thing. To answer your question about strains of bacteria, I'm a big fan of feeding the microbes and feeding them fibers and fiber-rich foods, which I know is hard sometimes with children. The sooner you can do that, the better. Probiotics are good, but they're pretty transient. Most of them will not change the microbiome. They can clinically help with symptom relief. So, for example, Bifidobacterium, actually Lactobacillus rhamnosus is really good for relaxation and calming the nerves, and can be used clinically for depression and things. But, it's not going to stay. So it's kind of like symptom control and symptom management. If you really want to alter the microbiome and change them, then what you want to do is feed them. So when you feed your bacteria probiotic-rich foods and foods that are rich in polyphenols like pomegranates, things that have really tough like leeks and onions and have stuffed fiber that they have to break down, they then have to produce short-chain fatty acids. And short-chain fatty acids like propionate and acetate and butyrate are actually what release mucus, and then the mucus is what repairs the gastrointestinal lining. So it is in that process that we are doing that restoration work. So we're not only increasing the diversity of the microbiome, but we're also repairing the gut lining. And then when we repair that gut lining and we increase the diversity, we're actually creating different types of microbes that then produce GABA, which is the neurotransmitter to calm us down and create, reduce anxiety in our children. And this is great for the brain and great for the entire body. So not the neurotransmitters come up a lot. A lot of times people talk about the microbes producing neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine and GABA. Those are not necessarily used for the brain when we make them in the gastrointestinal tract, even though they can travel and be used, via the vagus nerve. They're not really utilized by the brain, but we are using them throughout the central nervous system and through the gastrointestinal tract. So they are controlling peristalsis, and they are keeping the body and our entire central nervous system calm and in control. So it's really important for us to be thinking about behaviors and our children's bodies and keeping us restful and sleep patterns and our central nervous system. And these neurotransmitters are really regulating that type of mood and behavior. So clinically, yes, we can use certain strains like Lactobacillus rhamnosus. Bifidobacterium longum has been used very effectively as a probiotic for ADHD and autism. Some of the other ones, the Bifido strains are good. Lactobacillus plantarum is good. That's in pickles, sauerkraut, kimchi. That's actually been very effective. So, we can certainly get them in food too. There's certain strains that are also available in cheeses, like cultured cheeses and things that are very effective as well. And especially when you combine them with the longum and the health, another one that's called I think it's called Lactobacillus helveticus, I think it's called. Maybe it's helveticus. And that longum in cheese, that combination together is very important for nerves and relaxation and calming the system. So we know that they're found in fermented foods naturally, but then, of course, using them clinically and in probiotics can be helpful as well. Yeah.
Cool. So in terms of that, that's certainly, if you don't have background in some of that, the clinical aspects of the different bacteria and so forth you mentioned, that would likely be something you'd want to work with a nutritionist or some sort of a practitioner who has experience in that, I would imagine. Right.
Yeah, and that's a good point. We track, in my clinic, we track every clinical outcome of every strain of bacteria. So I have a lot of data on every single strain and what it does clinically and all of its findings. So you're right. Certainly the average person is not necessarily going to do that. But so a couple of things to think about there is what I just talked about, that when we take those foods out, like the genetically modified foods that have glyphosate out, there's two things that are important that are happening in the context of what we just talked about. One, that the glyphosate is actually killing off a lot of those good microbes and leaving behind things like Clostridia, which can be very prevalent in kids that have these types of neurological and developmental functioning, disorders. And so what we see is that we see this sort of rise in the microbes, pathogenic microbes like Clostridia, which is happening when we get those chronic, assault of the glyphosate, because it's an antibiotic that's wiping out, and antibiotic use, right? So if they're getting infections and you're taking antibiotics, you're wiping out all of these protective microbes that are there for all of these benefits, and you're leaving behind these pathogenic microbes. So it is that two-part thing where you're assaulting the body and then you don't have any of these protective microbes. And the second hand is that you're bringing in fermented foods, and pickles and olives and things that our ancestors used to use and have exposure to a lot, and foods that are grown in rich soil and getting exposed to nature and being outside and touching things that have microbes on them. And certainly that's re-inoculating. But then also, like I said, eating real whole foods, foods that might not be allergy-free, gluten-free, soy-free, dairy-free, oxalate-free, but are fiber-rich, that are feeding the microbes, because that's actually changing the microbiome and creating this diversity within the digestive system, which is going to alter the function of the brain. So you're really looking at it as a long game, because, if you don't change the body and start treating health long term, then ultimately you're still in disease management state. And so this is where people get stuck. And so what I just want to encourage your families to be thinking about when we think about ADHD is that, yes, you do have to do things for symptom control, and you do have to, trust me, I get it, and there'll be some weeks and some days that you're just going to do whatever you need to do to get through the day. But ultimately, you're going to have to put together some type of plan so you can really build strong, healthy children. And in treating health, ultimately you are treating ADHD, because, healthy children, even if there are parts of their cognitive brain that are somewhat compromised, that's the part that you want to get stronger, right? And so you're asking the microbes to become your allies in that work. And that's really what we did for our son. He had such severe cognitive deficit, to the point of not being able to speak. Was nonverbal till he was 8, couldn't write, couldn't read. He's a straight A student, runs cross country, high honors. The most unbelievable penmanship is is an undetectable, was medically undiagnosed at age 11, has had 8 diagnoses, has none. So when I say to you, it is, if we didn't see it with our own eyes, we wouldn't believe it ourselves. It is a huge capacity for the body to correct. And you have to use those microbes. They have a genome that's so superior to the human genome that you're tapping into something that is so extraordinary, okay? And it is constantly changing for you. So it's just this powerhouse that is underutilized, underappreciated, constantly changing, constantly working for you. And the only thing it wants so much for you is for you to feed it. Not to harm it, and to feed it. And the other thing that diversifies it is exercise. Physical exercise. That's what shows diversity. When they look at athletes, and I know that a lot of times kids on the ADHD, they are hyper, and parents will say, well, they're really busy, or they're hyper and they move around a lot and they don't need any exercise because they're busy. They need to really engage those large muscle groups. Push-ups, pull-ups, sit-ups. A lot of times they have a lot of atrophy. They have apraxia. They have poor coordination. And they need cross-body movements. They need to see, the brain needs to start exchanging information across the blood, the barriers. So getting those large muscle groups, those big back muscles, the glutes, the hamstrings, I cannot stress it enough. This is the biggest return on your investment for glutathione production, mitochondrial function, bar none. There is no supplement on the market that's going to do that for you. I cannot tell you enough. I have seen it with my own eyes. It is the hardest thing to get your children to do today. So consistently getting them to do that, 10 minutes a day, all the way through. They will resist it. They will cry. They will run away. And you will just bring them back and keep making them do it with you. Keep it fun. Turn on great music. Just find a way to incorporate, really engage those large muscles and get that physical body engaged in this process. It is a whole body approach. You could have the perfect diet. If the body is compromised, if it is weak, you will not get hormone production. You will not get the hormones to metabolize. You will not have good body alignment. You will not have good elimination, detoxification, brain function. good sleep, all of it. You have got to really engage that. It's so important. It's the biggest regret of all of the families that I work with that have older children. It is their biggest regret that they didn't stick with that.
Yeah.
That they wish they really had pushed that and stayed with it. And because as adults now, they're adult children who have ADHD, that's the area where they feel is most compromised.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and really, that's such great input, because a lot of the resistance or difficulty parents have a lot of times is around things like what you said about thinking they have to be in the kitchen all the time, or the expense of changing over. Exercise is free. I mean, it's built in, right? And so what a great natural, in the ultimate sense of the word natural, approach to take. And, I really appreciate that tied throughout your whole message, that really it's about, bringing forward and sort of encouraging each person's own body to mobilize its own, healing potential. And that's really what the point is. That's really what everything I hear you talking about is for, to really encourage that and build that, rather than the alternative of chasing symptoms and trying to manage symptoms. And it sounds like, I mean, what a great example, you guys are, your family. I mean, 21 diagnoses, I think I heard you say. And I mean, that's a remarkable story. And what a cool thing that, that it was, rather than trying to track down and check off or cross off all 21, it was really building up each person, as a whole.
Right.
And I also just want to say, it's remarkable. And I applaud you for, going through that journey, to really heal your family. I mean, not that it was only you, certainly everybody in the family had to do part of it.
Yeah, it was hard. Yeah.
But I mean, that's quite a thing, and to stick with it to the point now, where you're mentioning your son has, lost his diagnoses, is straight A student, all these things. You yourself with the different, I mean, all the different things you mentioned, all the different challenges you mentioned, and all the things you're up to now. So that, what a great story of going through the journey and then turning around and sharing it with the world too. So, I really appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I want to say to parents too and families, it isn't to say that it isn't hard and that we didn't have really tough times and that we didn't do probably a lot of what other families are doing, that we didn't struggle and make lots of mistakes, But I think ultimately what we realized was that if we shifted our values and started to live more in congruence in our own home about what was really important to us collectively as a family, that it actually became easier, a little bit more liberating, because we were really in harmony with what was really important to us. And it wasn't really about, undoing diseases anymore. It was just, talking to our kids about what it really meant to be healthy and what was important to us. And it didn't even mean that we would be disease free or that we would be diagnosis free, because that ultimately wasn't even our objective. Like, that actually happened to us, but that was never our intention. We didn't say, we're going to get rid of this for you, or we're undoing this. That was a side effect of something that happened, but we never went into it with that intention. And I don't think people should. I think that your children are extraordinary, not in spite of, like you don't have to not have ADHD. You can have ADHD and have an extraordinary life. The idea is to really create health in your children and to find out if they are having dysfunction and to enhance the health of their full body as best you can so they can have a healthy life. And if the symptoms of ADHD are a result of their body being out of balance, then that will self-correct. And so you'll sort of find that out on your own.
Right.
But to try to then troubleshoot it and get rid of it is really where people get, I think, frustrated, because you're sort of chasing your tail all the time. It's sort of like so I think the idea is to just, really look at the individual and say, how do I just promote health and how do we do that collectively, because we're sharing microbes in our family all the time. And we want to be sharing the good kind and not be contributing to that problem by, being the weak link, shall we say.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
awesome. I'm sure that, and I know that the question is going through many of the viewers' mind. This is listening and really enjoying the information. It's like, okay, so what do I do now? What's the first step? And I know you had prepared a guide to get people kind of started, at least on the food side of things.
Yeah.
Can you just tell us a little bit about that and where they can find that? Or we'll put the link below. But
Yeah, cool. So the food is really just, I like to tell people you don't have to go to the rainforest to get any kind of special tincture or anything, I like people to look at the foods that they're currently getting right now from their grocery store and to recognize what it is that they're actually doing in the body. So I'm a big proponent of understanding medicinal qualities of our everyday foods and then recognizing what their potential is so that you can better utilize them. So I took sort of what I would consider the top 10 foods that are kid friendly in the sense that they're whole foods, but they're, you can work with them. And then, and they're whole food based and just try to infuse those in your diet whenever you can, but then recognizing what the history is and what their potential is systemically in the body, so that you can recognize how they would contribute to building a resilient body and just, try to incorporate those in and see their long-term benefits. So it's a downloadable free e-guide. It's all color. It has the history and the knowledge and what's in the foods, the healing compounds.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And I know you mentioned in our pre-chat that you're not a big self-promoter, but I am going to ask you to do a little bit now.
Okay.
So because you're, an author of a book, you have another book coming out, I think, hopefully next year. Tell people where they can find those, or I guess, well, the one that's current and then the one, keep up with you so that they can find out about the new one.
Great. Yeah, so the film, the documentary film is called Secret Ingredients. That's secretingredientsmovie.com, and that should be out very shortly, probably the next 30 days or so. So they can go to that website and see the trailer, and then that, if they sign up for that email, then they would know of any when it's available. The trailer is also available on my website. My website is my name, Kathleen DiChiara. And then I do some teaching online. I teach online courses to families and practitioners. I don't work one-on-one very much anymore just because I don't have any slots available, I don't think, until next year. But people can get on a waiting list at now. And then I do teach other practitioners and do master classes right now. And then my book, The Hidden Connection, I wrote in 2014. I have a new edition coming out next year on that. And then the book Resilience is coming out with Hay House either the end of next year or early 2020. And that will be about cultivating long-term resilient health. So that's the best way to find me.
Awesome.
And then I'm most active on Instagram, and that's my name.
All right, I'm going to put all those links in the comments below this video, so if anybody's feverishly scribbling them down, they'll all be there, ideally clickable. And all right, well, I appreciate you taking some of your time with us. I know you get a lot of requests, so you're a busy person, so I thank you so much for taking your time with us today and sharing some of your great wisdom and information. And everybody listening, go check out those things. Let me ask you, because I don't know, the Secret Ingredients, how's that going to be available? Is it going to be online? Are they going to distribute it on like Netflix and those kind of places? Do you know?
I think both. Yeah, I think both. We just finished the festival tours, so we received multiple awards and we did that. So now I think it'll be probably iTunes, streaming, Vimeo. Yeah, so it'll be multiple ways for people to get it through lots of different platforms. Yeah.
Awesome. And I had the opportunity to get a pre-screening, I guess, at Autism One in May, and it was wonderful. It was very moving and full of great information, and so I highly recommend everybody checking that out when it's available too.
Cool. Yeah, really great. Yeah, and I'm glad too. And there were a lot of other families and other stories in there, which I think is really helpful too. It's helpful to learn the information, but then to see it in the context of people's real life experiences, which I think is really great.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thanks for having me, and thank you everybody for joining in today.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you. And, all right. You guys, you take care.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode of Kids Eating Broccoli podcast, connect with us online. You can find us on Facebook at Kids Eating Broccoli Podcast or at Dr. Brad Ellisor DC. You can also go to our website, drellisor.com. That's DOCTORELLISOR.com. Go to iTunes and leave us a review and a rating, or on Stitcher. And be sure to keep in touch with us so you can hear the next episode. Sign up for our mailing list or like us on Facebook. You guys take care now, and let's make the next generation the best generation.